My son called it a family meeting. That's what he said when he phoned on a Tuesday evening in October, while I was in the middle of making butternut squash soup, the kind with a little nutmeg and cream that my late husband Gordon used to say was the only good thing about November coming. My son said, "Mom, we need to sit down together, all of us. There are some things we should talk about as a family." I turned down the burner and asked what things. "Just practical things," he said. "About the future. About how we make sure everything is handled properly." Handled properly. I was 68 years old. I had been handling things properly since before he was born. His name is Colin. He is 41, works in commercial real estate in Calgary, and married a woman named Shelley who has strong opinions about everything and shares most of them before she's fully sat down. They have 2 boys, 7 and 9, and a mortgage on a house in Tuscany Park that I know because Colin told me himself 3 years ago they stretched for. I am not supposed to remember that detail. I have noticed that the things inconvenient to other people tend to become the things they assume you've forgotten. The meeting was that Saturday. They drove up from Calgary to my house in Red Deer, which is where Gordon and I raised Colin and where I have lived for 31 years. The drive is 90 minutes. They arrived 40 minutes early. I was still in my garden coat when Colin knocked. Shelley walked in behind him carrying a tote bag that clinked when she set it on my kitchen table. Wine, I assumed, though no one offered any. My neighbor Pauline had stopped by that morning to drop off preserves she'd made from her Saskatoon berries, and I'd left the jar on the counter. Shelley moved it aside to make room for her bag without asking, a small thing. But I noticed small things. We sat down. I made tea. Shelley declined and poured herself water from my tap like she already knew where the glasses were, which she does, because she's been here many times. But there's a difference between knowing where the glasses are and moving to a kitchen like it's yours. Colin folded his hands on the table. He has his father's hands, wide across the knuckles, and when he folds them like that, he looks serious in a way that is half genuine and half performance. I've known him 41 years. I know the difference. "Mom," he said, "we've been thinking a lot about your situation." My situation. I had a cup of tea, a garden that had just finished producing more zucchini than I knew what to do with, a book club that met every 3rd Thursday, and a financial advisor named Stuart who had managed my RRSP for 11 years without incident. I was not aware I had a situation. "What situation is that?" I asked. Shelley set down her water glass. "You're alone out here," she said. "The house is big. The winters are hard. We worry. The house is 3 bedrooms. Gordon and I bought it in 1993 for $212,000. It is worth, according to last year's assessment, considerably more than that. I did not bring this up, neither did they. Yet, I manage fine," I said. "You do," Colin said quickly, too quickly. "The way you agree with someone when you need them to feel heard before you say the thing you actually came to say. But Shelley and I have been looking at options. Just exploring. Nothing decided." Shelley pulled a folder from the tote bag, cream-colored with a tab on the side. I noticed she had already written my address on it in black marker. "There's a financial planning structure," she said, "that a lot of families are using now. You transfer the primary asset, the house, into a joint family trust. You stay here. Nothing changes day to day, but it protects the asset from probate. It's very common in Alberta." I looked at the folder. I did not touch it. "Is it?" I said. "Stuart would have mentioned it," Colin added, "but these kinds of conversations are easier within the family." Stuart had not mentioned it because there was nothing to mention. My estate was organized, my will was updated, and I had a power of attorney already assigned to my sister's daughter, Vivian, who is an accountant in Edmonton and who I trust completely. I did not share any of this at that moment. "I'll think about it," I said. Colin smiled. Shelley straightened the folder on the table so its edges were parallel to the table's edge. I noticed that too. They stayed for dinner. I made the soup. Colin had 2 bowls and said it was excellent, which it was. Shelley ate half a bowl and talked about a podcast she'd been listening to about aging in place and community transition planning, which is apparently a field now. She looked at me while she talked about it. Directly, steadily, with the expression people use when they want you to absorb something without feeling like you're being sold it. After they left, I washed the bowls and stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the backyard. The birch tree Gordon planted the year Colin was born had gone fully yellow. Every October it does that, and every October it still catches me off guard. I was not frightened. I was paying attention. I did not call Vivian that night. I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down what had been said, not because I was confused about it, because I've learned that the difference between what people say and what they mean tends to show up more clearly when you write it down. Joint family trust, primary asset. Protects from probate. They had used 3 legal-sounding phrases in a single conversation and brought a pre-labeled folder. This was not a family meeting. This was an opening position. Hello, everyone. I'm Claire. And this is a story about learning that when someone calls something a family decision, they usually mean it's already been decided. Colin called on Wednesday. He asked if I'd had a chance to think about what they'd discussed. I have, I said. And I'd like to understand it better, I told him. I have some questions. He sounded encouraged. Of course, ask anything. Who drafted the trust structure? I asked. A pause. A colleague of mine. He does a lot of work in this area. A real estate colleague. He handles estate matters too. And has he spoken to Stuart? Not yet. We thought it made more sense to talk to you first. They had thought a great deal about the sequence of things. Talk to me before talking to my financial advisor. Get the folder on the table before any independent review. Move the glass before anyone notices the glass was moved. I'll be in touch, I said. On Thursday morning, I drove myself to Stuart's office. His firm is on Gates Avenue, 2nd floor, above a dental clinic that always smells faintly of cloves. I've been going there for 11 years. His assistant Frances, not the Frances in the used names list, a different Frances entirely, a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, offered me coffee and I said yes, please, 1 sugar. I told Stuart everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciate about him. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me over his glasses. Elaine, he said, a joint family trust of the kind they're describing does not primarily protect your estate from probate. What it primarily does is give the co-trustees significant oversight over asset decisions. I had suspected something like this. Hearing it confirmed was different from suspecting it. Who would the co-trustees be? I asked, though I already knew. In the structure they're describing? Almost certainly Colin and Shelley. Stuart spent the next 40 minutes walking me through my actual options. He was clear, unhurried, and thorough. By the time I left, I had a list of 3 things to do and the name of an estate lawyer he trusted. Her name was Dr. Woolley Okonkwo, and her office was in Lacombe, 20 minutes south, which was far enough from Red Deer that the chance of running into anyone I knew was low. I did not tell Colin I had spoken to Stuart. That Sunday, Colin and Shelley came again. No warning. I was on the phone with my book club friend Harriet when I saw their SUV turn onto my street, so I had approximately 40 seconds to finish my conversation and decide how I was going to be when they walked in. I decided to be ordinary. Tea, biscuits, nothing on my face that would tell them anything. Shelley came in carrying a laptop this time. We found a really clear video, she said, that explains the trust structure. It's only 12 minutes. I did not watch the video. I appreciate that, I said, but I'd like to understand the legal specifics better before I look at anything else. I've got a few questions that came up. Colin leaned forward. Like what? Like what happens to my ability to sell the property independently if I decide I want to downsize? Shelley answered before Colin could. You'd still be consulted. Nothing would happen without your input. Consulted, not decided by me. Consulted, and the boys' hockey registration, Colin said then, pivoting smoothly. The new arena fees went up again this year. Between that and the mortgage, things have been tight. There it was. Not quite the point of the visit, but close enough to it that I could see the shape of what they needed. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. We're not asking for anything, Shelley said quickly, but the folder was still in the tote bag and the laptop was still open on my kitchen table, and Colin's hands were folded again in that way that meant he had something else to say. They left an hour later without anything resolved. At the door, Colin hugged me and said, "We just love you and want to make sure everything's set up right." I hugged him back. I said, "I know." I went inside and locked the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. The house was quiet. Gordon's reading chair was still in the corner of the sitting room where it has always been. The boys had pushed the footstool aside when they visited at Christmas, and I'd never moved it back exactly right. I called Dr. Riley, Okonkwo's office the next morning and made an appointment for the following Thursday. On Tuesday, my bank called, or someone called claiming to be from my bank, a man with a very smooth voice who said there had been a routine flag on my account related to a third-party inquiry and that he was following up to confirm my account details were current. I told him I would call the branch directly and hung up. When I called the branch, they told me there had been no inquiry on my account, but they also told me that the previous Friday someone had called asking general questions about account modification processes for elderly account holders. They could not confirm who had called. They had not flagged it as unusual at the time. I sat with that for a long moment after I hung up. Then I opened my notepad and wrote down, Tuesday, bank call, false flag, Friday inquiry, unconfirmed source. I called Pauline next door and asked if she'd noticed anyone around my house in the past week, any cars parked that she didn't recognize. She said on Friday afternoon a dark SUV had been sitting across the street for about 20 minutes. She hadn't thought much of it. Colin and Shelley drive a dark SUV. That afternoon, Shelley texted me a link to an article titled, "Why More Canadian Families Are Choosing Joint Trusts for Senior Wealth Management." I didn't open it. I screenshot it and added it to the folder I had started keeping on my own phone. On Thursday, I drove to Lacombe and sat across from Dr. Okonkwo in her office, which smelled like cedar and had a window that faced a small park. She was in her early 50s with very steady eyes and a way of listening that made you feel she had already set aside everything else. I told her everything from the beginning, the Saturday meeting, the folder, the trust structure, the bank call, Shelley's text. She asked 3 or 4 clarifying questions and then was quiet for a moment. "What they're describing," she said, "wouldn't protect your estate from probate in the way they've suggested. What it would do is establish co-trustees with authority to challenge your independent financial decisions if they argued those decisions weren't in the trust's interest." "Could they do that while I'm alive and competent?" I asked. "Potentially, if the trust language was drafted broadly, and if they were able to establish a pattern of decisions they characterized as imprudent." Pattern. Documentation. The bank inquiry suddenly fit into a larger shape. "What are my options?" I asked. She spent the next hour laying them out. There were several. The cleanest one, she said, was also the most decisive. I could establish an irrevocable living trust with a trustee of my choosing. Vivian, for instance, transferring the property and primary financial assets into it before any legal motion could be initiated. If the assets were already in a trust with a designated trustee, there was no basis for Colin and Shelley to petition for oversight. The leverage would dissolve. "Would that look like I was acting under duress?" I asked. "Not if you act before any formal motion is filed," she said. "And not if you document your decision-making clearly from the start." I called Vivian from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring because she always does. I told her what was happening. She was quiet for about 4 seconds, which for Vivian is a long time. "How long have you been tracking this?" she asked. 3 weeks, I said. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what you need." I did not feel relieved. I felt resolved. Those are different things. On Friday, Colin called to say they were planning to come again Sunday and that Shelley had spoken to their colleague about some adjustments to the trust language. "To address your concerns," he said. "That's thoughtful," I said. "I'm looking forward to seeing you." He sounded cautiously optimistic when we hung up. I understood that tone now. It was the tone of someone who believed they were further along in a process than they actually were. That evening, I made a pot of Earl Grey and sat in Gordon's chair and called Vivian back. We talked for an hour and a half. By the time we hung up, the structure of what I was going to do was clear. I slept better that night than I had in 3 weeks. Sunday. They arrived at 2 o'clock with the boys, which was new. The boys bolted for the backyard immediately, and I heard the older one already claiming the tire swing. Shelley had a new folder, pale blue this time. Colin sat down at the table with a smile that suggested we were all going to come to an agreement today. We had some of the language reviewed, he said. I think you'll find it much clearer now about your continued right to reside. Right to reside. In my own house. Clarified for me in pale blue. I poured the tea, I offered the biscuits, I asked about the drive and about the boys' hockey and about whether the price of gas had come down any between here and Calgary. Shelley answered in a way that was distracted, like a person trying to stay polite through the preamble. Eventually Colin opened the folder. If you look at section 2, he said. I looked. I read it carefully, clause by clause. At one point I asked for a pen and made a small mark in the margin next to a phrase about trustee discretion in the event of decisions inconsistent with the trust's stated purpose. What does this mean exactly? I asked. Shelley leaned over. It just means the trustees can step in if there's a concern about asset management. The trustees being you two. And you, Colin said, you're listed as primary trustee, but the discretion clause applies to all trustees equally? A brief pause. It's standard language. I closed the folder, set my pen on top of it. I appreciate the work you've put into this, I said. I'd like my own lawyer to review it before I sign anything. The shift in the room was immediate. Subtle, but immediate. Of course, Colin said carefully. Who are you using? Someone I found independently, I said. I'll let you know once she's had a chance to look at it. Shelley's expression changed in the way that happens when a plan has moved slightly off its expected course. She reached for her water glass. We just want this to be something you're comfortable with, Elaine. I know, I said. After they left, I sat at the kitchen window until the SUV was fully off my street. Then I got up and washed the cups. The next morning, I was back in Dr. Okunwo's office. Vivian had driven down from Edmonton and was sitting in the chair beside me. The three of us went through everything. By the time I left, the paperwork had been initiated. It moved faster than I expected. Dr. D.I. Okonkwo was thorough and fast, and Vivian understood every line of it without needing it explained twice. The irrevocable trust was drawn up with Vivian named as sole trustee, and it was structured so that my right to live in the property and direct its use was entirely protected for my lifetime, while the ultimate disposition of the estate followed my existing will. The day I signed it, Dr. Dersault, Okonkwo asked if I was certain. I told her I was more certain than I'd been about anything in a long time. That evening, Colin called. He said their colleague had a few more revisions to the trust language and asked if I would be available that week. I won't be signing anything, I said. A beat. What do you mean? I mean I've made my own arrangements, I said. Another pause, longer. What kind of arrangements? Independent ones, I said. The house and my primary assets are now in a trust, a different structure than what you proposed. My lawyer has the details if you have questions. The silence on the other end was the kind that happens when someone has been tracking a direction and suddenly the ground isn't where they expected. You did this without talking to us? Colin said. Yes, I said. The same way you spoke to your colleague before speaking to me. He started to say something and stopped. Started again. Mom, you didn't need to do this alone. I didn't do it alone, I said. I did it independently. Those aren't the same thing. Shelley's voice appeared in the background, low and fast, asking what was happening. We'll call you back, Colin said, and hung up. They did not call back that evening. They came instead. 2.5 hours later, headlights in my driveway at 9:37, which I know because I looked at the clock. I'd been expecting them, which is perhaps why I'd already locked the door. Colin knocked. I answered. He looked like a man who had spent 2 hours in a car recalibrating his position. Shelley looked like a woman who had spent 2 hours in a car explaining to him what the new position should be. Can we come in? Colin asked. Yes, I said, and stepped aside. We sat in the living room, not the kitchen. I didn't make tea this time. I sat in the armchair that faces the couch, which meant I was facing both of them, which felt like the right choice. Colin started with a statement that was dressed as a question. Can you explain what you were thinking? Yes, I said. I was thinking that you had come to me with a legal structure that would have reduced my independent control over my own property and finances, drafted by someone in your professional network after making an inquiry to my bank about my account without informing me. Shelley's jaw tightened. We were worried about you. I know you were worried about something, I said. That's not fair, Colin said. The bank inquiry, I said. Was that about worry? He looked at the carpet. You could have challenged that trust, Shelley said then. If you had concerns, we would have listened. You brought me pre-label folders, I said. You arrived 40 minutes early on a morning I wasn't ready. You showed me a video I didn't ask to see. You moved the timeline along and described the intervals between steps as consideration. I did consider. And then I acted. No one spoke for a moment. There's nothing to contest now, I continued. The trust is irrevocable. My assets are protected under my terms, not yours. And Vivian has full documentation of every step I took and why. Colin looked up. You're doing this because you don't trust us. I'm doing this because I do trust myself, I said. Those aren't the same thing either. Shelley's voice went flat. You should have discussed this with us first. Why? I asked. She blinked. It's my property, I said, my retirement savings, my house that I've lived in for 31 years, that your father-in-law and I bought together, that I've maintained alone for 6 years since he died. At what point in that history did it become something that required your approval before I could act? Colin's voice came out quieter than before. We have boys to think about, we have costs. I know, I said. And I did know, and I did feel something when he said it, because I am his mother and he has his father's hands, and I remember him at 9 years old asking me once if we were rich, and I told him we were comfortable, and he seemed satisfied with that, and went back to his cereal, but knowing something and agreeing to bear its costs for someone who didn't ask you first. Those are different things. The trust doesn't prevent me from gifting in my lifetime, I said. If I choose to help, I can. But that will be my choice, made freely, not structured into paperwork in advance. Shelley stood up. She didn't storm out. She just stood up and gathered her coat from the arm of the couch, deliberately, which was somehow worse than if she'd been dramatic about it. I hope this was worth it, she said. I won't know for a while, I answered honestly. Colin stood too. At the door he turned back. You're not who I thought you were, he said. It was meant to land hard. It did. But not in the way he intended. I'm exactly who I've always been, I said. You just assumed I'd changed. They drove away. I locked the door. I stood in the hallway with my hand on the doorframe and breathed in once, slowly. Then I went to the kitchen and finished the soup I'd had going on low all evening. The next morning was a Tuesday. October was past its middle now, and there was frost on the birch tree before the sun fully came up. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and watched the ice crystallize on the branches in the early light, which is one of those things that sounds like something you'd read on a greeting card but is, in fact, just a true thing about mornings in Alberta. I called Pauline and told her I wouldn't be in Red Deer for much longer, not because I was fleeing, because I had been thinking about it before any of this started. Gordon and I had talked once, years before he got sick, about retiring to the coast, British Columbia, somewhere with softer winters and water nearby. We never did it because there was always a reason not to, and then he was gone, and the reasons became habits, and the habits became years. I phoned Stuart that afternoon. We discussed the equity in the house and the trust structure and the timeline of what a sale would require, not urgency, but movement. He said the Okanagan market was strong. He suggested a property manager he knew in Kelowna who specialized in helping buyers from out of province. I called Vivian to tell her. She said she had already wondered if that's where this was heading. How did you know? I asked. Because you sound like yourself again, she said. Colin called that Thursday. His tone was different. Not warm exactly, but not tactical either. Just tired. I talked to Stuart, he said. I know, I said. Stuart had mentioned he might reach out. He told me about the trust, Colin said. He explained how it's structured. Okay, it's actually pretty solid, Colin said, which was the closest he was going to come to saying it was fair. It is, I agreed. Silence for a moment. Shelley thinks you did this to punish us, he said. I did this to protect myself, I said. Those are two different things. I know, he said quietly. And I believed him a little even through the phone. He asked if I'd be willing to have dinner before Christmas. I said I would think about it. That had been his line not long ago, and I was not above the symmetry of it. After we hung up, I went to the Saskatoon berry preserves Pauline had left me and opened the jar and ate some with a spoon, straight from the jar, which Gordon would have found appalling, and which I found satisfying in a way I can't entirely explain. I began making calls about the house in December. Not publicly at first. The agent I used, whose name was found through a referral from Dr. Okonkwo's office, handled the initial inquiry quietly. 2 showings, both pre-qualified buyers, both without any connection to anyone I knew. By late January, there was an offer. I sat with the offer for one evening before accepting it, not because I was uncertain, because I wanted to feel the weight of it and put it down with full awareness. I signed in February. The buyers were a couple in their mid-30s, a teacher and a physiotherapist. They asked if they could keep the tire swing. I said yes. The day after closing, I drove through the alley behind the house rather than the front street. The birch tree was visible over the back fence. Yellow was still months away. I slowed for a moment, then drove on. I called Colin from the car. I've sold the house, I said. A pause. When? Yesterday. Where are you going? He asked. Penticton, I said. I looked at several places. I like the lake. He was quiet for a moment. You really did it. I really did. Mum, he said, and then stopped. I know, I said, and then stopped. I know, I said. Penticton in late March is not yet warm, but it is getting there. The lake doesn't fully lose its gray until April. I moved into a condo on the south side of town with windows that face the water and a building full of people who know nothing about my family arrangements, which is exactly as many people as I need to know. The first week I was there, I walked every morning along the waterfront path. There's a stretch of it near the marina that faces west, and if you're there in the early evening, the mountains turn pink before they go dark. Gordon would have loved it. I called the boys my grandsons on a Sunday in April. They put me on speakerphone while they were eating, and I could hear the sound of forks and Shelley in the background telling the younger one to stop kicking his chair. They asked if my new place had a pool. It does not, I told them, but it has a beach. Can we visit? The older one asked. Yes, I said. Do you promise? He asked. I promise, I said, and I meant it. Because one thing I have learned in 68 years is that the people worth keeping close are the ones who treat your life as something to share, not something to manage. My grandsons are 7 and 9. They are not responsible for the decisions of their parents. And I'm not so certain of my rightness in all of this that I would let them pay the cost of a conflict they didn't start. In May, Colin and Shelley drove out to Penticton without the boys. 3.5 hours from Calgary, through the Coquihalla. They called an hour before they arrived. That was different. I made coffee. We sat on the balcony. Shelley looked at the lake for a long time before she said anything. It's beautiful, she said finally. Not warmly. But honestly, it is, I agreed. Colin looked older than he had in October, which is something that happens when autumn has been hard. He held his coffee cup with both hands and said, We owe you an apology. I waited. We convinced ourselves it was practical, he said. But it was also, we wanted something that wasn't ours to take. Shelley didn't add to that. She didn't need to. The fact that she was there on the balcony, that she had made the drive, said more than most of what she'd said in my kitchen in October. I know you were worried about real things, I said. Money is real. Uncertainty is real. I'm not pretending the pressure wasn't there. But it wasn't yours to fix, Colin said. No, I said, it wasn't. We sat there a while longer. The lake was gray-green in the morning light, and a pair of Canada geese were working their way along the shore below in the unhurried way that geese have, as if they've never once in their lives felt the need to rush. At one point Shelley asked, without quite meeting my eyes, whether I had made the decision about selling entirely on my own. Vivian helped with the legal part, I said. But yes. Your financial advisor too? Yes. She nodded, and I could see her working through what that meant, that I had not been isolated or confused or led, that I had called my own team in my own order and made a plan. I didn't think you'd move this fast, she said. I've been moving at this pace my whole life, I said. You just weren't watching. She looked at me then, and for the first time since October, she looked at me directly and without calculation. That's probably true, she said. We didn't resolve everything over coffee. I don't expect we will, not quickly and not cleanly. Trust is not a document you can redraft with better language. It grows back the way gardens do, slowly, and only if you keep showing up. But they came to Penticton. They sat on the balcony. Colin apologized in words, not just implications. And Shelley looked at the lake honestly and said it was beautiful. That's somewhere. It's been 6 months since I signed the papers in Dr. Okonkwo's office. 6 months since I stopped waiting to see what Colin and Shelley were going to try next and started moving in the direction I had already been wanting to move. The condo is smaller than the house in Red Deer by about 600 square feet. I have kept almost nothing that didn't mean something to me. Gordon's chair is in the corner of the living room. The tin of buttons my mother carried from her own mother's house is on the dresser. The jade teapot, no. That belongs to a different story. My teapot is a brown Betty, the one Gordon gave me our second Christmas, the ceramic worn smooth from 30 years of handling. I open the balcony door in the mornings and drink my coffee with the lake sound coming in. Gulls sometimes, geese often. The mountains don't move. I started volunteering at the local library 2 mornings a week, processing donations, helping with programs for seniors, recommending books to people who describe what they want in vague and hopeful terms. Someone once told me they wanted something warm but not sappy and not too long. I handed them a novel and they came back the following week to tell me it was exactly right. That felt like enough for a Tuesday. Vivian visits in the summer. Pauline has already asked if she can come in August, and I've told her yes, and I mean it. The boys are coming in July. Shelley and Colin, too. We'll take them to the beach. I've already looked up what's good for children that age to do on Okanagan Lake. There are paddle boards. The younger one will be terrible at it and laugh about it, and the older one will work at it too seriously before eventually also laughing, and I will watch from somewhere dry and close. That's what I want. Not the house I sold, not the years before October, not some version of things that looked easier from a distance. Just the July afternoon that's still coming, the lake, the boys, the ordinary forward motion of a life that is entirely mine. I didn't fight in a courtroom. I didn't shout. I didn't beg anyone to understand. I made a phone call. I drove 20 minutes south. I signed my name on my own terms, and now I'm here. If you're watching this and something in it felt familiar, a folder on a kitchen table, a question you weren't sure was a question, trust that feeling. You've earned the right to act on it. Don't wait for someone else to tell you when the time is right. You already know. Like this video if it meant something to you. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done. I read them all. Goodbye. There's something I've been thinking about since all of this settled. Not about Colin, not about Shelley, not even about the house. About the folder. That cream-colored folder with my address already written on it in black marker. Brought to a table that was still mine, in a house that was still mine, in a conversation that was framed as concern but structured like a transaction. I've thought about what I would have done if I'd been a different version of myself. If I had been the version of myself that wanted to keep the peace more than she wanted to keep her clarity, I think I know what would have happened. I would have smiled at that folder and said I'd think about it, and then I would have kept saying I'd think about it until one day I stopped thinking about it at all and just signed. Not because I was confused, because I was tired. Because it's exhausting to be the person who keeps asking the next question when everyone in the room is waiting for you to stop. What I've learned, not as a lesson I read somewhere, but as something I know now in the way you know things after you've actually lived through them, is that the people who love you without conditions don't arrive with pre-labeled folders. They don't rehearse the sequence of their visits. They don't answer your questions about legal language by telling you not to be sensitive. When someone tells you that protecting yourself is the same as being difficult, they are describing their own disappointment, not your behavior. I don't say that to be hard on Colin. He is my son, and I know where his fear comes from. Real costs are real. A mortgage that stretched too far is a real thing to lie awake about. I understand that. What I couldn't accept was being the solution to a problem I hadn't agreed to carry. Because here's what I've come to believe. The choices we make when we're under pressure reveal what we actually value. Colin and Shelley, when the pressure of their finances met the pressure of my aging, chose to move toward what they could take rather than toward what they could offer. And I, when I felt the pressure of that, chose to act on my own behalf rather than wait for someone to act on it for me. Both of those things are true. Both of those things had consequences. The consequences of my choices are a condo in Penticton with a lake view, a granddaughter of an attorney who knows exactly where my assets stand, and a relationship with my son that is smaller than it was, but more honest than it has been in years. The consequences of their choices are a trust they cannot touch and a drive they had to make to come and see me instead of the other way around. I'm not triumphant about any of that. I'm just clear about it. Vivian once told me, when we were going through the paperwork, that the strongest thing a person can do is make a decision so thorough that there's nothing left to argue about. I think she was right. And I think it applies beyond legal documents. It applies to the way you decide who you are and what you'll accept and where the line is between love and obligation. When you draw that line with enough precision, other people stop trying to move it. I'm 68 years old. I have a brown Betty teapot and a balcony and 2 grandsons who are coming in July. I have mornings where the only sound is the lake and the geese and the coffee working its way through the pot. That is not a consolation prize. That is the whole point.